Ahoy, everybody! Welcome back to another video. Today we are recapping two races. This last weekend we saw the 1,000 miles of Sebring for the FAA World Endurance Championship, the first in their new season, and we also saw the 12 Hours of Sebring, the second race of the 2023 IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. We're going to be talking about both races and give some thoughts on both of them. So let's start off with the 1,000 miles of Sebring. So I don't know why they call it the 1,000 miles of Sebring. When in reality, it's the 8 hours of Sebring. So they covered a total of something like 875 miles. So we were a ways off from doing that whole 1,000 miles. And that's unfortunate because it was a relatively clean race in terms of lack of safety car intervention or anything like that. So, yeah, there is that. So let's just call it the 8 hours of Sebring, and because it's never reached 1,000 miles at all. So let's just kind of not call it the 1,000 miles. But if you guys watch my preview video, we talked about Toyota was going to win this. And that's what happened. This was, for all of the touting of a new era of sports car racing for the World Endurance Championship, it seemed pretty much status quo with two Toyotas at the front. The number 7 Toyota Gazoo Racing GR10 with Mike Conaway, Kamui Kobayashi, and Jose Maria Lopez took the win by 2.1 seconds over the sister number 8 with Sebastian Buemi, Brendan Hartley, and Rio Hiriakawa. And then it's a 2-lap gap back to the pole-sitting Ferrari AF Corsa 499P, the very much highly touted Ferrari 499P on its debut. So, couple thoughts. So obviously this was going to be a Toyota walkaway. We knew it from the beginning. Yes, Ferrari got the headlines with the pole position, but the pole doesn't matter in terms of history. Now this was WEC's last 1,000 miles of Sebring. I'll get into that towards the end of the video and my thoughts about this whole Super Sebring thing. It's really turned into more of a debacle than a thing. But yes, Ferrari did get the pole position, but did anyone really expect them to win? On the debut race for this 499P, it was very unlikely. Toyota have 2 full years ahead of everybody else, and except for Glickenhaus, in terms of development of the car and experience with this car. They've had time to break it in, dial it in, and this is why I said in the preview video that it would take a catastrophe for Toyota not to win this race, and that's exactly what happened. It was a smooth, clean sailing race for the Toyota team, and they took the win by some 2 laps over the nearest car, which was the Ferrari AF Corsa. Now, Toyota were doing Toyota things. They kept the cars close, but they didn't, they kept the cars close to each other. I mean, a 2.1 second margin of victory is not much at all. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, that's how Toyota usually operates. They usually keep the 2 cars within, touching distance of each other whenever they have the race firmly in the bag. I mean, you can look at pretty much any Le Mans that was unhindered, where both cars went unhindered, I should say. But Ferrari takes home a podium in their maiden appearance. It wasn't a clean race for the Ferrari camp. The 51 car did have contact with another Ferrari, ironically. So that one fell back quite a ways, but the 50 car had a clean race. They had a little bit of a confusing pitch strategy because we had a Ferrari 488 flip upside down on the 5th lap of the race, and then they opted to pit the cars and get them off sequence. And here's the one thing I've learned about this modern era of Le Mans prototype racing. You can't let Toyota get by themselves, because once they do, they're just going to set course and smooth sail to the victory. It's something that I've learned in every Le Mans since Porsche left. So every Le Mans since 2018, where you let them have space and they're going to run away with it, and you're not going to see them again until they're lapping you. And that's unfortunately what the case was in this one. Fourth position, Cadillac, in their debut in the hypercar category, the number 2, with Earl Bamber, Alex Lynn, and Richard Westbrook, formerly known as the 02, when it raced in IMSA last year. Strong debut. It stayed on par with the Ferrari. It showed pace throughout the weekend, but it was not on the ultimate pace. Now, this is one of those LMDH cars, and I think this is exactly kind of what we were expecting was the purpose-built hypercars going out there and claiming all 3 podium spots, and then we'll see the LMDHs kind of mix in elsewhere. And that's kind of what we got. The number 2 car finishes 4th, and then the 2 Penske Porsches, number 5 and 6, finished in 5th and 6th. A further 2 laps adrift of the 3rd and 4th place finishing cars, and 4 laps to the winning Toyota. Again, kind of expected. The Penske Porsches did not really have the pace throughout the weekend. They were kind of just there. And keep in mind, these 2 chassis, this was their first race. Now, it was the 963's second race, but it was for these 2 chassis their first race. Not all cars are built the same. And that's something that we've learned is sometimes the chassis are the thing that make the difference. And it seems that this was the case here. They're brand new cars. They have less testing miles than the IMSA cars do. They do have testing miles, but not as much. And also, this is Penske's first race in the World Endurance Championship. This is Porsche's first race since 2017. And it's their first race with a chassis and hybrid system that they specifically did not build. So for them, a finish without major issues is still a finish. And it's more than can be said for their IMSA counterparts. Now, 5th and 6th, kind of downer in terms if you're a Porsche fan. All of this hype, this year and a half build to this debut on the global stage for the 963 since it was debuted, and it can only muster being 4 laps down in 5th and 6th. Now, if you're a Porsche fan, here's my advice. Don't worry. The Porsches typically do not really come into their own until we get to June, July, like when it really counts. Usually the first year for a Porsche program is a throwaway year. That you can date that back to the 917s. If you look how terrible those cars were at first, and then they got developed and refined, and now we remember the 917 as one of the greatest prototypes ever built. The same thing is true for the 919. If you remember back, it wasn't until the final race of the WEC season in Sao Paulo where Porsche got their first win. Otherwise, the 2014 season for them was relatively forgettable, especially when you look at the seasons that would follow in 15, 16, and 17. But they did not have a Porsche perfect 2014 at all. They had a lot of issues. And I think that's something that kind of flies under the radar is Porsche, their first year of a program usually is very rough, and then they go out and mop the floor with everybody. In terms of the rest of the pecking order, we got the LMP2 team, the winner in LMP2 that took 7th place with Hertz Team Jota. Now keep in mind there were 11 hypercars entered into the race. Unfortunately, we did lose a couple by the wayside, but the number 48, the Hertz Team Jota entry with its Orica 07 took 7th place and an LMP2 win. And it's funny because this is the 38th squad. So this is kind of a stand-in team that's not competing in the full WEC because the 38 team will be up in hypercar with their Porsche 963 later in the season. So for Jota, it's kind of interesting that they let the 48 car take a win. Now, if it was the 48 car ahead of the 28, the sister car, I'm sure it would be different. They would actually afford to kind of swap positions there. But for the 48 team, good. It was David Beckman, Will Stevens, and Yiffy Ye taking the win. They finished some 9 laps adrift of the overall winner, which is pretty typical for a WEC race, but Prima Racing grabs P2. That one, Not really a surprise because they came on strong. They're another one of those Formula feeder teams that have kind of jumped over to the World Endurance Championship. You know, there was one other, and I can't remember it. I'm so sorry. I should know this, but they're another one of those teams that kind of jumped over. Um, Man, now it bothers me that I can't remember that the other team that did it. I'm sorry. But no, so they definitely had another strong showing. They made their WEC debut last year, and it looked like their biggest competition would have been WRT. But no, once again, Prima showing that they are a top-notch team when it comes to sports cars, at least. Now, then again, you have to keep in mind that it is basically a spec class with all Orca 07s. It wasn't designed to be, but it is at this point. But they ended up taking home third with United Autosports in second. United had a very difficult season last year, pretty much across the board in whatever they ran after a dominant 2021 campaign. So it's good to see them back on the podium. It's not until we dive down to 15th place in the overall that we see the next hypercar entry. This would be the number 51 AF Corsa Ferrari. This is the other 499. This is the one that had contact with one of the GT AM Ferraris. Ended up being some 11 laps down after repairing the damage to that car. And then we jump to the winner in the GTE AM class, which would be the number 33 Corvette Racing entry with Nicky Katzberg, Ben Keating, and Nicholas Verone. So Ben Keating, once again, showing that he's a super... I think he's still a bronze driver, which is kind of interesting because he's competed in about everything and he's won about everything that you can want to in the sports car world, or at least in the Le Mans sports car world. He started out with Vipers, and then he had a Ford GT, he had a Mercedes AMG, he's raced an Aston Martin, he's now in a factory Corvette. And I'm actually really surprised that WEC is letting them compete under the Corvette Racing banner, because typically factory teams are not allowed in GTE AM, but I guess it's kind of a whatever at this point. Kind of smoke them if you got them, as this class is dying. But Corvette win on their final home soil race in WEC competition, and a way to get sent out. And honorable mentions would be the number 4 car. They call it the Floyd Van Wall Racing Team. I am going to call them Collis. They had a very troubled weekend. Free practice 3, the car barely even made it out of the pit lane. They were behind the wall multiple times. They ended up being 24 laps down. They still finished, which is something kind of more of the same that we have expected from this team, unfortunately. I wish it was a team that I could say that showed pace or promise or anything, but unfortunately the Bicolis team just has never been up to par. Now, if you want to dive into the history of this team, they did compete in WEC with their CLM, which was actually originally a Lotus that dated back to 2014, and then the Collis team took it over in 15, and it's either caught on fire or crashed at every Le Mans it competed in. And the one Le Mans it could have won in 2017, it went out on the first lap. Yeah, it was kind of a pretty stereotypical race for the Collis team and their Van Wall. There's not much else to say. A team that I really had higher hopes for was the Peugeot team and their 9X8s. So they were 31st and not classified, but they finished 31st and 32nd. Some 26 laps off the pace for the 93 car with Mikkel Jensen, Paul di Resta, and Jean-Eric Verne. I really had higher hopes for this team. Now, I do understand that it's a car that was designed and built to race at Le Mans, not Sebring. It was a car that is very low drag. There's no freaking rear wing, for God's sakes, on this car. It was not meant for the bumps and downforce demands of Sebring, and I understand that. but they still had a multitude of mechanical problems with this car. And I had hopes that they would have had that solved. I mean, they did compete in half of the WEC races last year, everything outside of Le Mans, or excuse me, all the races after Le Mans. And I thought that, with all the off-season testing that they did and all the time that they had to prepare, they would have been able to have a better showing. And unfortunately, that did not materialize in the 875 miles of Sebring. It was a difficult race for them. Like I said, I had high hopes for them. I'm curious to see what kind of they can do at Spa. I'm very scared. I'm going to say this now. I'm very scared for the way that car is going to be at Spa. Just because, yes, it is very low drag and it is it's a very sleek car, but I'm very scared for how that car is going to navigate the Eau Rouge complex, because that has been troublesome for those low drag, very slippery aerodynamic cars. It's probably the most dangerous track for this car, and I'm morbidly curious to see what's going to happen once this car gets sent up that corner at pace for the first time. Now, my hopes for Peugeot at Le Mans are diminishing. I will put that out there because they have not had one clean race yet with this car. They've had mechanical issue after mechanical issue after mechanical issue, and it seems like they've learned nothing about this car to this point. They are completely lost, it seems, and there's no rebounding at this point. And that disappoints me to see. I'm forever an Audi Sport fan, and Peugeot will always be the mortal enemy. I am a kid of the 2000s. I started watching in that era. Okay, don't blame me. But, I just hope that they get to grips with this car. I really, really do. Because they could be a serious threat, especially at Le Mans, where this car was purposely designed for, if they could get their stuff together. And that's the big question. Now, Peugeot, kind of like Porsche, it usually takes them a couple years to get their programs together. We saw this with the 908 and 07. They were the dominant force at all the Le Mans Series races, but that's because they weren't competing against Audi, their chief competition. But they had Audi's number at Le Mans, pretty much every year that they raced against, except for 07 and 2011. They were always consistently 3 or 4 seconds a lap faster. But they only had the one win in there, and that's because of mechanical issues or the drivers just being too on edge. And most of the time it was mechanical issues, and most of the time it was something stupid like headlights or something like that. Or even wrong tire choice. And obviously I understand that was a generation ago in terms of drivers and mechanics, but Peugeot, they always have the sacrificial year as well. And 2007 was it for the 908, and for the 9X8, it's kind of the same. Another team that I really had hopes for would be Glickenhaus. This is not a team that has had difficult luck in the series. Now, they've not done full time. They've done the bare minimum just to get into Le Mans. And I understand that they had electrical issues, but this car is not a brand new car. It's in its third season of competing, even though it hasn't done a full season yet. But it's not like it's a brand new car. They're good with the Pippo motor. That's been pretty bulletproof so far. I'm just a little bit shocked that we've now the Glickenhaus is having issues. It was never really on the pace at all over the weekend, and that's something that concerns me for the future because the Glickenhaus had its moments of brilliance in the last couple of seasons, but that's because WEC needed that. They needed somebody to go up against the Toyotas, and they couldn't possibly have the Alpine do it because that's the old generation grandfathered LMP1. So who's it going to be? Glickenhaus. And again, the Glickenhaus has shown moments of brilliance. However, this weekend as a whole was not it. They were completely off the pace from the beginning, and it's kind of a salt in the wound, especially for an American team, to go out after 62 laps with an electrical issue and be that far off the pace over the weekend. So WEC race was very status quo for WEC races. You know, there was nothing particularly exciting about it. It's just kind of the way things played out. Now then, there's a reason the WEC race, and I'll talk about this at the end of the video, I promise. There's a reason that they're the first race and not the main event. Now we get to the 12 Hours of Sebring, and oh my god, what a race. From the start, I mean, we knew we were in for something special. 8 GTP, or as I like to call them, DPI 2.0s, took the green flag. We had 2 Cadillacs, 2 Porsches, 2 BMWs, and 2 Acuras, and they did put on a great show. The Cadillacs had the qualifying pace. However, it seemed the Acura had the race pace. Now, there was some significant BOP adjustments from Daytona to Sebring. I'm glad they're calling it just BOP and they're not calling it EOT. But the Cadillacs and the Porsches were running their WEC BOP, or actually I should say the WEC cars were running their IMSA BOP. And I don't know, I'm a little bit surprised by the results. You know, I didn't ever get around to releasing my preview for the Sebring 12 hour, because in that video that, again, I never released, I said that the 31 car was going to be either winning the race or it would be crashing, and in this instance it did both. So it had an incident early on in the race. I mean, it was the pole sitter. I should throw that in there. But it was the pole sitter. It did have an incident with an LMP3 car early on that damaged the nose and took off one of the wing mirrors. They were able to bounce back. The car also had a refueling sensor issue where they could not get the full allocation of fuel into the car, or it was just pumping really slowly. They came back. Now, granted, if it wasn't for what happened with give or take 25 minutes to go, the 31 car probably wouldn't have won this race. But, you know, they did. You know, so Jack Aiken in his second IMSA race, after kind of leaving the junior formula, or the formula feeders, I should say, and the F1 world to come over, Pippo Durrani picks up his 5th win at Sebring, and 4th in the 12 hour. I say 5th because he did win the Sebring sprint race in 2020. And then Alexander Sims, a former BMW factory driver, now that has moved over to the Cadillac program, those 3 drivers take home the win in a 2.9 second margin to second place. And this one's a surprise. It's the BMW Team RLL. So, honestly, I didn't have high hopes for this team during the Rolex 24 and in the lead up to Sebring. They had a abysmal Rolex 24 at Daytona. They were out of the game before sunset with both cars. Both cars suffered some major issues. They did both reach the checkered flag, but it was not a clean running by any stretch of the imagination. And they come home 2.9 seconds behind the 31 car. Now, granted, it was a 5-minute dash to the finish line, but BMW, they had to keep themselves in the game. Now, the 24 car was the first retirement out of the GTP class. It had a cooling issue, and it had to be retired about midway. However, for the 25 car, it was also not necessarily a clean run, but it also, most importantly, did not have any major mechanical issues. They had to do a brake change towards the end of the race, which you shouldn't have to do typically on one of the prototypes. Usually, that's kind of reserved for the GT cars, but that cost them time. They had to spin, but otherwise, they were just kind of poking around at the back of the GTP field, but they were within striking distance the entire way. So, the BMW team actually legitimately had a pretty decent race with the 25 car, with Connor D. Filippi, Sheldon Vanderlinde, and Nick Yellowy. Yellowy. I always have problems pronouncing that. But they definitely, had a good race. Third place, an LMP2 car, Tower Motorsports. John Farano, Scott McLaughlin, and Kiffin Simpson. Some 4 laps adrift. but they still get an overall podium at Sebring, and they get a win in LMP2. So, if you have asked me before the Rolex 24 if I expected or what race I would have expected the LMP2 car to get an overall podium, I would have said Daytona. I thought Sebring, the GTP cars would have had it figured out by now, and they do in terms of reliability. I mean, we only had one true mechanical failure. The Meyer Shank car had lost a wheel, but and that would have been the ROL car with that mechanical failure. But I thought that Sebring was going to be the first one where we could really see what the GTP cars could do. But no, on this one, and don't get me wrong, we still saw what the GTP cars could do. But no, an LMP2 car sits on the overall podium with John, or I already said the drivers, but John Ferrano, the team principal, and, the silver driver in there. Scott McLaughlin, of course, the 3-time IndyCar winner and driver for Team Penske. And then Kiffin Simpson, who is one of the Chip Ganassi junior drivers. Fun fact, his flag is from Barbados. They, had a clean run. Now, Kiffin Simpson actually did crash the car just past halfway, but they never actually went down a lap. It was all cosmetic. They changed the nose and the rear wing, and they were back on their way. They only dropped to third in that. And to give you an idea, the top 5 cars all finished on the same lap in P2, so to only drop to third when having a crash that heavy is quite an achievement for the Tower Motorsports crew. So definitely props to them for getting that car turned around quickly, and Scott McLaughlin was able to take it home and claim the checkered flag. And then TDS Racing got second in class and fourth overall, and then Era Motorsports picked up the third place in P2. Dwight Merriman had a clean race because he's a little bit known for crashing a lot. But Era Motorsports actually had a really clean race, and they managed to bring it home. TDS had a very tough race because both of their cars stumbled into trouble at some point or another. But scrolling down to 9th, 10th, and 11th. Now, this is the big one. The 2 Penske Porsche Motorsport 963s and the Wayne Taylor Racing Acura. The Wayne Taylor car definitely looked like the car to beat in the race. I mean, they had a visible advantage over even the pseudo-sister Meyer Shank car. The Wayne Taylor car just was good all day long. They were not the best. That would be the 01 Chip Ganassi Racing car, Cadillac. And we'll talk about them here shortly. But outside of the CGR Caddy, definitely the Wayne Taylor Racing Acura was the favorite to win. Now, the Porsches, in the daytime, they had some issues. I believe the number 7... Well, no, I was actually thinking of the last time Penske Porsche had a first race at Sebring when they had to change an alternator. But the 7 car had a clean race, mechanically speaking. That car was actually pretty quiet throughout the race. The number 6 car had a less than quiet race. It clipped a Acura and had to replace the tail section. Then it got slammed into from behind by an LMP3 car and had to replace the tail section. It had to come to a stop on the track because it was smoking in the cockpit, and he had to bring it back to the pits with the door open to kind of ventilate that. But that issue was solved. So it's very, very interesting that the 6 car was the one that had all the problems, but it was still the pace setter between the 2 cars. When the sun set, the Penske Porsche cars came to life. They had a very unremarkable daytime period at Sebring. However, they really came to life in the later, in the last 2 hours of the race. And they were up there fighting for the win. And, of course, the number 7 car was involved in that 3 wide moment in the final hour of the race between the Wayne Taylor car, and the 31 Whelen Action Express Cadillac. But obviously, the big moment that everybody's going to be talking about is the crash. So with 25 or so minutes to go, they're catching GT traffic for the first time after a full course yellow, and the 6 car, gets bottled up behind a couple GT cars, and the number 10 with Felipe Albuquerque on board tries to make a move to dive around in the scrum. The 6 car, Mateo Jaminet, moves over, pushes the 10 car off in the grass, slides across the track, collects the number 6 car, and the 7 Porsche gets pushed into the crash by a GTD Porsche, and then ends up going over top of the sister number 6, and that is the end of the event for the Penske Porsches and for the Wayne Taylor car. Obviously going into the last hour, they were the 3 picks to win. The 1 hour sprint at Sebring, but unfortunately, it didn't play out that way, and it was kind of a cruise to the end moment for the 31 car. The BMW did not get a great start on its run back. So, a podium is still a podium for the BMW team, but unfortunately for, the 3 favorites towards the end of the race, it did not prove to be much more than that. LMP3, the number 74, Ranch 74 Resort, Riley with the Ligier JSP 320 took the win with Josh Burton, Felipe Fraga, and Gar Robinson. They had an engine blow up at Daytona pretty early on, but luckily that race was not for any points in LMP3, so they assumed the points lead in the P3 class. But let's talk about LMP3 for a second. At this point, I honestly do not believe that we need to have P3 in the class or in the field. They become more of a nuisance than they have an asset. Now, it made sense back in 2020, 2021 when we were only getting 39 at most cars at the Rolex. Now we're getting really, now we're at the point where we have to kick cars away. Where we have to actually select who's going to race at the Rolex because there's so many entries. So there's no point in P3 even existing. They cause more cautions than anything. They are literally the reincarnation of Prototype Challenge from the early days, where you don't really pay attention to them. They're kind of out there on the track, but they just need to kind of go away. They were really a field filler for IMSA when it was at its worst. And now we're seeing IMSA when it's at its best, and there's really no reason. P2 shows why it should be there. P3 is, I don't know. There's no reason for them to still be around at this point. There was a lot of inexcusable crashes that shouldn't have happened. And, the prime example is definitely I think it was the Performance Tech car that just was driving around the entire field under safety car and rear-ended the number 6 Porsche. I don't know what was going on there, but it happened and it shouldn't have. So, yeah, P3 at this point just go away. And this is coming from somebody who is an advocate for P3 being added to the championship. But at this point, they've kind of proved me wrong and why they don't deserve to be in the main roster. They should be kind of the premier class in Prototype Lights or IMSA Prototype Challenge, whatever they call it now. And then you graduate up to P2 in the main series. But there's no reason for P3 to really be around anymore. Next up, something that we haven't seen in a bit is the GTD Pro winner is ahead of the GTD winner, and this time it's PAF or FAF. One of the two. FAF Motorsports taking the win. First win for the 992 generation Porsche. So, in the lead up to this race, in terms of GTD talk, there was, are the Porsche teams going to pull out? Or, because they, no lying here in saying that Porsche didn't have a great Daytona, and there was a lot of concern that they would carry the same BOP that they did at the Rolex 24. But it was adjusted in the race week, and the Porsches weren't necessarily the strongest car in the grid on the GT3 side of things, but they were competitive, and Pfaff takes the win. Klaus Bachler, somebody who comes over from the VLN or NLS, kind of depends what you call it, but the Nürburgring series where he races for Falcon Tire and their Porsche. Of course, Porsche factory drivers Patrick Pillay and Lawrence Vantor. Very strong lineup in there. Obviously, if you're going to name a weak link in that team, it's going to be Bachler, but he has many years of experience behind him in a Porsche, racing all those years for Fricadelli and for Falcon on the VLN scene. But as I mentioned, IMSA adjusted the BOP for the Porsche 992 generation GT3R, and it seems to have worked out nicely. They were not the clear favorites throughout the race. I don't think there really was a clear favorite to win the race, but Pfaff was able to do Pfaff things and capitalize and grab the win. They take the win over the Vasser Sullivan Lexus. That's an interesting one because that car is in its 6th year of competition. Yeah, 7th year of competition, and it's not been upgraded since it debuted back in 2017 with 3GT Racing. And it's still a competitive car. That is, a testament to Toyota where they're able to build a car that has lasted this long without any major upgrades and is still competitive. Now, I get that there's the BOP element to it, but it hasn't fallen like the wayside like, say, the Acura NSX has. So, kudos to them. Of course, Vasser Sullivan, they became a real force in the GTD ranks. And another force would be the 79, the WeatherTech Racing Mercedes. This is the first race without Cooper McNeil behind the wheel. He retired on top after the team won at Daytona. This time they had Mauro Engel, Jules Gunan, and Daniel Huncadella behind the wheel of that AMG GT3. They had a new chassis with them for Sebring. It's not the car that they won Daytona with. They had a strong showing during the during the 12 Hours of Sebring. Obviously, they had a strong showing during the Rolex 24. But once again, that team is able to show up and show out at every race. I mean, it's a full Mercedes factory lineup with them. They finish in 3rd. Of note, in 4th position is the Iron Lynx, the number 63 Ferrari with Lamborghini factory drivers Jordan Pepper and Frank Pereira, and I believe Romain Grosjean is now a Lamborghini factory driver as well. They bring home 4th. Solid run for them. They didn't have an incident-free race. There was a few off-track excursions for that car, but it was still a good race for them. Nothing really to report special about it other than they were kind of in there and in the mix. Corvette Racing, they had a very eventful race. They come home in 5th in GTD Pro. They had to change a shock at one point. They got caught up in that big incident with the 2 Porsches and the Wayne Taylor Acura. They were at one point 2 laps down with a couple hours to go, and they managed to claw their way back up. They finished on the same lap, but P5. And then Risi Competizione with the Ferrari 296 in its 2nd race. Not a bad race. They actually led a fair amount of laps with that 296, so it was good to see that car actually kind of do something. I know definitely there was quite a few BOP adjustments after the Rolex, and obviously the Porsche got a pretty good one and then a pretty good BOP adjustment in their favor. The Ferrari was lucky enough to get a nice little adjustment too because they were competitive throughout the race. Unfortunately, they weren't able to string it together at the end, but they were right there in the fight up until the last hour to go. So for them, not terrible. 24th in the overall, the number 16 Meyer Shank car. The Meyer Shank car was not as big of a factor as I thought it would be. Now, obviously, that car has a new engineer on it after after it had its Deflategate controversy after Daytona. They took a big hit in the championship, losing all of their points, losing all of the reward money, even being penalized an additional 50 grand. They got to keep the watches, but beyond that, they really didn't gain anything from the Rolex. They lost their engineer. Mike Shank is on probation with the series until the end of June. So there were some pretty hefty penalties involved with that number 60 Acura. And it's kind of interesting that it was Acura that kind of pointed it out to the series. So their own manufacturer is like, hey, something ain't right. But for them, they had their moments in the lead, but they were not really a prominent factor in the race. Unfortunately, with the hour and a bit to go, they lost a wheel, which was weird because they were like 9 or 10 laps into their stint. So they were getting close to halfway through their stint when that wheel departed on Tom Blomqvist. But you got to wonder how much of the engineering shakeup was involved in that car and not being the dominant force it was at Daytona. And how much is it of them trying to, be very clean cut, clear, and precise about following the rules because they are under a microscope after the shenanigans at Daytona. The Meyer-Shank team, they are a very competent team. They've been around since 2003, 2004. So for them, obviously, they know that they don't have to win Sebring. They were up there, but they were never really like a favorite to win. Like the Wayne Taylor car was a favorite to win. But yeah, I did expect a little bit more out of them. Actually, honestly, I didn't know what to expect out of them after I think we saw a neutered version of Meyer-Shank Racing, considering they want to tiptoe with the rule book and stay in a straight line because, of course, they have a microscope on them now. All right, so and I did put that space in there so I could have a little bit of a drink real quick, because I am recording this all in one take, so that should be a little bit impressive. BMW 1-2 in the GTD class with their M4s. Again, another manufacturer that struggled at Daytona was the M4 GT3. They didn't have necessarily the greatest season last year with that car, because last year was the debut year for the M4 GT3. They were good in the short distance races, but the endurance races they kind of struggled in. But the M4 is able to claim a 1-2 with Paul Miller Racing, with Corey Lewis, Brian Sellers, and Madison Snow taking the win. And then Turner Motorsports in second with Michael Dinan, Robbie Foley, and Patrick Gallagher. So BMW had a strong showing. It was a close class all the way through. There was plenty of excitement and moments out of this class. Wright Motorsports had a very interesting race with the number 16 car. They got collected in an incident with a Mercedes. The Mercedes were up there. The Kirchhoff, number 32, and then also the Windward 57 Mercedes. Now, the Windward car retired after contact with the 16 Wright Motorsports entry, but the Mercedes, they were quite pegged back afterwards, but it was really a toss-up throughout the race of who was going to win. There was no real dominant car throughout the race. It just kind of played down into strategy and who was placed where at the right time. Third place, the Kelly Moss Porsche, the 992 generation, takes home a podium there. Again, the BOP adjustment that the Porsches got, of course, that BOP adjustment came as a result of a lot of the Porsche teams threatening to just leave. They had a very solid race. All the Porsche teams did. So for them to collect third, and then they got 6th, 7th, and 8th in class, not bad, not a bad day. And then I'm gonna throw this out there. In fourth place, the Inception Racing McLaren. So the McLaren is starting to really prove itself as a proper GT3 car, the 720S. We've seen it have its moments of excellence, in the SRO series. But here in the States, it hasn't really shown. It's it's had good moments at Daytona. Last year it was in a fantastic position until the morning when it started to have issues. But the McLaren itself is actually proving to be a decent car. And it's starting, with the new Evo kit for that 720S, it kind of takes it a step further. So that car is definitely coming along. It's improving as it goes. And, they're starting to be able to put together the fine balance of being fast, because there's no doubt that that car has a lot of aerodynamic features to it. And that's something, if you've never seen a GT3 car in person, you will know the manufacturers that have an F1 counterpart, like Mercedes, like Ferrari, like the McLaren, because there is so many little intricate aero bits on those cars. And that car, I've seen it race in person. It definitely looks like a fragile car, but it does have pace into it. But the trip up to that car has always been, it has been a fragile car. And it's always seemed to end up being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So for McLaren, they're starting to be able to put the pieces of fast and reliable together. And now they lead the GTD points. So not a bad weekend for them. Vassar Sullivan, they bring home 5th place with the number 12 car in GTD to kind of wrap up that little recap. Heart of Racing, they had kind of a difficult race with both of their cars. The 23, the GTD Pro car, lost quite a few laps after an off, I believe. And then the 27, the GTD entry, had a pretty big laid off in the race as well. So they had a rough one. They had a little bit of a rough go of it. And let's go ahead and dive into kind of some of the retirements. We already talked about the 24 BMW car. It would wind up 51st place after 172 laps with an overheating issue. We talked about Windward Racing with their incident that destroyed the left front suspension when they collided with the Wright Motorsports Porsche. But the big one in terms of retirements has to be the 01, the Chip Ganassi Racing Cadillac. So they had a fire on the car, which is very interesting. So from what I've heard, it was part of the hybrid or the battery store on the car, which is made by Williams. That is an interesting one because we have seen this battery pack have issues. We saw this Penske Porsche have to replace one at Daytona. We saw the BMW cars have issues with theirs at Daytona. They had to replace one as well. I'm curious to see if this little smoking issue I spoke about earlier on the number 6 car, if that was related to it. But this battery pack actually caught fire on that number 01 Cadillac V-Series R. Luckily, Bourdais was able to catch it and come into the pits, so the car was not in any real immediate danger. Like, if it did kind of burst outside of where it was contained to, there would be help there instantaneously. Now, unfortunately, that was the end of the line after 241 laps. But I tell you what, they really did have the car to beat. The 01 car was really not good off on multi-stinted tires. Like, if they tried to double a set of tires, it didn't work too well. The car just seemed very unhappy. However, the trio of Bourdais, Dixon, and Van der Zande, they were able to put that car in places that nobody else would. That car was just so planted, and it ran really well around the Sebring corners, especially in Sunset Bend. They were able to tighten their lineup pretty much right to the inside of that inside wall. And that's a line that you don't really see people taking, but they were able to take that really short route around there, and they made the car stick. Because usually the cars in Sunset Bend and turn 17, they want to slide out as much as possible. It's kind of what we saw with the Tristan Vautier accident a couple years back with Spirit of Daytona. But that 01 car was able to just stay planted right where they put it. It looked like it was a really good car on new tires. Beyond that, it did have a couple spins on used rubber. And you only had 11 sets, and you'd be looking at probably about 15 pit stops for the GTP cars across the 12 hours. So there was at least 3 or 4 stints that they would have to double stint, and those couple stints, the car just struggled. But when it was on fresh rubber, it would rocket its way to the front, and it seemed like it was almost unchallenged. Though the nearest challenge was that Wayne Taylor Racing number 10. So that's kind of what we're looking at kind of in terms of the recap for that race. I know this is more of a long-winded video. I mean, we're looking at probably about 50 minutes right now. Now, I'm not going to go too much longer, but let's recap the weekend as a whole. WEC was very kind of typical. We expected Toyota to win, and Toyota did win. For IMSA, it was a race that was kind of all over the place. There was no clear favorite throughout the race at all. And I think that was a really good thing. The 12 Hours of Sebring once again showed why IMSA deserves the main event. They deserve the spotlight of the Super Sebring weekend. It was a fantastic race start to finish, and it's what, as IMSA fans, we have come to expect and enjoy, and it's great for new fans getting in. And the best part is it's not a manufactured kind of thing where we need to stop the race after 4 hours and reset everything or whatever. It was a down-to-earth endurance race. And to first survive the race, or to first lift a trophy, you have to survive the race. And in order to survive the race, you have to survive the track, which is difficult at Sebring. You know, the age-old saying is that this track does more damage to a car than in 12 hours than in 24 hours anywhere else. And once again, that kind of gets proven. It's why Sebring is a testing ground for so many of these cars. And it showed. And it pushed the GTP cars to their limit. So once again, IMSA shows why they deserve to be the main event at the Super Sebring weekend. WEC disagrees. They want their race to be the main event, and it's once again the FIA and ACO having their heads so far up their asses. It's unbelievable. It's something that I've railed against for years at this point, is they want to be the main event whether their product is first best or second best. And in this case, once again, they're the second best. Now, when we had Lone Star Le Mans back in like 2014, 2015, the WEC deserved to be the main event. However, in this scenario, IMSA wholeheartedly deserved to be the main event. Now, this was the last Super Sebring. WEC will not be returning next year to do their 850 miles of Sebring. Yes, I know it's the 1,000 miles of Sebring, but I'm throwing shade at the fact that we never actually ever reached the 1,000-mile distance. But my only thought is, if WEC really cared about having the 12 Hours of Sebring slots, they would have, or they should have capitalized on it when they had the race in 2012. Because they did have that race in 2012. It was the inaugural race for the World Endurance Championship. It was a collaboration with the American Le Mans Series at the time. There was 9 classes, which was a little bit stupid, but it was a good race. Of course, Audi ended up winning, but I don't know why we couldn't do that now. That would be the ultimate thing to solve it, because we have cars that are supposedly on the same, in the same book, and then you could pit the GTE AM cars up against the GTD Pro and GTD and GTD Pro cars, and of course you got P2 and P2, so just combine those classes together, and P3 just get rid of them altogether. I mean, it's something that would be possible. I understand there would be a lot of cars, but we have 2 pit lanes to utilize. So why not? And actually, to finish that thought, what we could do is do the 1,000 miles and throw the checkered flag, and whoever wants to pull in and call it quits after the 1,000 miles and the WEC race is over, they can, and if they want to, they could go ahead and continue on to finish the 12 hours. They do that in SRO competition all the time, where you know, whenever there's the 8 hours of Indianapolis, it's also the championship finale for the GT America series, and after their final race is 3 hours, and they run the race at the same time in the same place with the IGTC cars. And then once that race is over, they throw the checkered flag for them, and you can either keep going or you can pit and retire the car. That's an option, but WEC doesn't want to go that route because once again, they have, even when they have something good in front of them, they have to have their heads stuck so far up their asses that they can see daylight again. So, is it unfortunate that we're losing the Super Sebring weekend? Yes, it is. I regret that we're losing it because it is a genuinely good weekend to have. But at the same time, if this is the route that WEC wants to go, have fun. Because I'm sure there's going to be another American around that replaces it. I hope there is. Hopefully it's within a 5-minute driving distance from me. But it's great to have a collaboration between the two series where they can run two different events at the same track in the same weekend, and we get to see kind of the best of both worlds. Because when you look at IMSA and you look at WEC, there is two different worlds there. On one, we have IMSA that is moving continuously forward. They embraced GT3 before it was cool to. They stuck around with the old until they could actually come up with a feasible replacement with the new. And WEC seems to always be on the back foot, and they always seem to... The problem with WEC, let me put it like this. They don't realize that bad things could ever happen to them until after they do. Why do you think LMP1 died? It's because they did not have the foresight to realize that you have 3 teams that are spending more than a Formula 1 team for half the races. And you don't think that that's an issue? The one thing that has always dictated sports car racing is the money. And for these guys, they're spending so much more money for half the races. Do you think it's easy for the Audi Sport people to justify that in a boardroom? Do you think the Porsche people find that easy to explain in a boardroom? We know Toyota doesn't have a problem with it. I mean, that's why we lost the manufacturers there. That's why we lost the manufacturers in GTE Pro, and why that class died is because they refused to cost cap things and they refused to be proactive instead of reactive to the situations around them. They just get so caught up in the moment of a golden era that they don't realize that golden era could end prematurely because they do not take proactive measures to ensure the longevity. That's always been the biggest issue with the World Endurance Championship. They know a good thing to their detriment when they have it. And they don't do anything to ensure the longevity of that. And once again, their ego gets in the way and they want to be the main event and they want the 12 hours of Sebring, but they can't have that because IMSA already has dibs. WEC had it and then they let it go. They made no effort to try to save the American Le Mans series when it was starting to go belly up. So they had the opportunity to have the main event for the 12 hours of Sebring. And listen, I love the Glickenhaus team to death, but Jim Glickenhaus is wrong. The most important race over the weekend at Sebring is not the 1,000 miles. That is a sideshow. The most important race at Sebring is the 12 hours of Sebring because there is 70 years of history there. The 1,000 miles of Sebring can't even go 1,000 miles. I'm not being a IMSA apologist, and I'm not being somebody who hates WEC. I genuinely like the World Endurance Championship. I just hate some of the decisions that they make that damage the sport. So there's some food for thought, and there's some of my opinions and thoughts and recap of the Super Sebring weekend. I definitely hope you guys enjoyed it. I do plan on doing more videos like this kind of down the line of previews and reviews and giving my thoughts and opinions or whatever. So, yeah, what was your thoughts on the WEC races? What was your thought on the 12 Hours of Sebring? Drop your comments below and we will see you in the next video. Peace out.